Hi there, this is Gianfranco Conti, and today I want to talk to you about my book, Breaking the Sound Barrier, which I co-authored with this Steve Smith last year. Um, it's um, it's a book that is pretty unique in its genre because it deals with listening, but it approaches from a completely different angle. And the angle is what I call listening as modeling. Um, Many years ago, I found myself in a little bit of a crisis. I realized that the way I was teaching did not reflect the way that humans are designed to learn. We're designed to learn languages through listening. This is the way a parent, a caregiver teaches languages to a child. And it's very much, um, it's a process full of love, full of affection. Is this little thing that's completely dependent on you, and his or her attention is completely unconditionally on you, and the child will take hours and hours, thousands of hours before he or she can actually speak, and it will be a process that goes completely through sound. Of course, there are images involved. There's gestures. There's a lot of complex interaction with different factors, but it's all mediated, unless the child is deaf, of course, it's all mediated by sound. And I found myself being in a classroom not doing that. Most of my lessons were not starting with a listening, substantive listening input, which would then become converted into output. The kids were now going from listening to speaking. Or if they were going through listening to speaking, it was not because the listening has modeled the speaking, but just because listening came first in the sequence. A couple of listening comprehensions at best. An audio track that they were listening to and answering questions about. That was not right. So many years ago, I'm talking about 14, 15 years ago, I came up with this concept of LAM, listening as modeling. In other words, the teacher taking on the role of a nurturer, which is actually what teachers do. It should be. They should be nurturers. We should not be testers, which is what a lot of teachers are when they do listening comprehension. They feel very much like tests, like exams, and these poor kids are bending their head down and writing whether it's true, false, or not mentioned, answering a few questions, which is really a perversion of real life learning. When you learn by looking at your mother or your friends or your peers or your relatives in the eyes. It's the worst thing you can do to a person, to a younger learner especially. Listening to somebody that you don't see the face or the facial expression of. It's just a completely perverse way of learning how to speak a language. And, Krashen used to say, teach to the eyes. And he was right. This is how we learn a first language, is that contact that is so crucial. That's why online learning, unless there is a contact, Skype is a bit better, but that's why normally remote learning doesn't really work when it comes to language learning. So the idea is that you are the teacher nurturer and that you initiate the whole process, that you plant your input in their heads and you find ways through a lot of staggered work, which is mainly listening in the beginning, and then you get consolidated by reading and speaking and writing. You get then, at the end of the sequence, to push out what you planted in their heads. Listening as modeling is about ensuring that your listening actually teaches the students how to speak. And if people object to what you're saying, and they say, oh yeah, but they need to listen to many accents, they need to have a variety of input before they speak. Just think, how many mothers did you have? You only had one, right? And it still worked. The most important thing is that in the formative years of language learning, especially in the first year, most of the learning, or a lot of the learning, a big chunk of the learning, happens through listen, because that's the natural route of acquisition for the human brain. We learned how to write and read because, unfortunately, the listening, oral input doesn't stay long in our heads. It's only a few seconds. In our sensory memory, sound lingers about 2 seconds. And every new incoming sound erases the previous one. So it's obvious that we need it to develop this secondary skill, which is writing. So the big point that books make is this: how can we ensure there are listening, teaching the students how to speak? That's why it's called listening as modeling. And it's based on the principle that before kids go to speak, must have plenty of opportunity to process that oral input. And in the book, we put about 240, 250 activities which do just that. And we also put across in the first chapter, especially, my principle of listening as modeling, which I elaborated over the years, and I converted eventually Steve Smith, my co-author, to kind of believe in them, is the idea that when you model, you are like a coach, and exactly as a coach would do with their football players or basketball players, you develop the various muscles of listening, and you teach them the various skills involved of listening. And using, to be honest with you, I did it instinctively 14 years ago, but using John Field framework, which I came across about 10 years ago, we then identified each skill involved in listening, what we call bottom-up skills. So phonological processing, the ability to identify sounds; syllable processing, the ability to identify syllables; lexical retrieval skills, which is the ability to retrieve words; and parsing skills, which is the ability to identify syntactic patterns and to identify what parts of speech you just heard, identify the word order and the relationships between words. By identifying the skills, we have then targeted each and every one of them through a range of activities, which are calibrated and conceived in such a way that the student learns through them what we call learned attention. Learned attention means that normally we pay attention to certain things depending on our upbringing, disposition, cognitive style. So one child might be focusing on sound when they listen. Another one might be focusing on grammar as they're listening. Another child simply focus on meaning. But if you want a student to really learn from the input, then you have to train their attention. You need to make sure that they pay attention to all the different levels of the input. So the idea is that the input that you provide at the beginning of a learning sequence is exploited at different levels through activities which develop the students' learned attention in all these different areas. And then we train them in those areas so that they become very good at identifying sounds, retrieving words fluently, in identifying patterns fluently. And of course, it doesn't mean that we don't want you to do your listening comprehensions. Absolutely not. Of course, those are important too. But it's the highest level. The brain, for instance, doesn't get there when we listen until about 400 milliseconds. What working memory does, it processes first all these lower levels of processing before it gets to meaning. So the whole idea of listening as modeling is you really training your students how to listen. You don't throw them in the deep end and get them to do activities from the textbook which are either too easy or too difficult. But you grade your tasks, you train the students in the art of listening. Between year 7 and 9, you make listening become center stage. And when you get to 10 and 11, these kids will be able to do the normal listening comprehension that you normally give them. I've worked like that for years with extremely low ability kids and really high ability kids. And I have used LAM all my life. I've used it in the classroom. When Steve Smith and I decided to write this, Steve Smith was a bit skeptical because that was not the way he's ever taught. And I can see why he had reservations. And I can see how for somebody to adopt this method in the classroom at the beginning can be quite challenging. All of a sudden, you become the center of attention. All of a sudden, the whole beginning of a sequence depends on you talking to the kids. But the activities we created and put in the books are engaging. I know that a lot of people around the world have been using them. The book is a bestseller, and it's really instrumental and influential in terms of changing the way people look at listening. Before I close, I just want to go back to something I said to you. Listening is the most important skill. We know that 75% of verbal communication in the real world, not in the classroom, in the real world, occurs through listening and speaking. About 45, we found in our research, occurs through listening. It's the most important skill. You can't be spontaneous if you can't listen spontaneously. You can't learn how to speak unless you listen extensively to things. So one of the very important principles of my approach, EPI and LAM, is extensive processing. In other words, the student needs to listen loads before they speak, and they need to listen to comprehensible input. 98% comprehensible input. We know that a normal child is about 98% comprehensible input in order for them to actually be able to learn from what they hear or what they read. 90%, on the other hand, is enough for students who are more able, the elite. So in the books we lay out, we have different chapters, each dealing with a different set of skills. So you've got a chapter for phonological processing, the ability to process sounds and syllables. Another one for lexical retrieval, the ability to teach listening through, vocabulary through listening, and for the kids to be able to understand and learn vocabulary through listening. Then we have a chapter on parsing, which is the ability to identify patterns, function words and words endings, verb ending, and all the rest. Then a chapter that focuses on meaning, so the typical listening comprehension. A chapter that focuses on discourse building, and eventually the book unfolds, covering everything you can think of about listening, including metacognitive strategies, which was inspired by the work of Professor Macker and Professor Susan Graham. And in the end, Steve Smith wrote a brilliant concluding chapter in which he gives advice to a department on how to develop listening resources and listening methodology in a typical department which struggles in that particular area. I'm very proud of this book because I know that I worked for years trying it out and researching it in my school. I'm very grateful to Dila Viñales, who I work with on the language gym for his input, because him and his department have tried it out in the Garda International School. They're kind of pioneers in this respect. And I'm grateful for Steve for co-writing it and for now become a passionate proponent of it. The guy, as I said at the beginning, was pretty skeptical, and now he's actually promoting it, is presenting on it. And of course, he doesn't understand every single aspect of it because he's never tried it in the classroom, but he's been extremely forthcoming and proactive in helping me writing this book, and he's done a massive work. And I want to thank also his wife, Elspeth, who was the editor-chief, in fact, the editor of this book, and she's done a fantastic job in enhancing it, not just proofreading. She's actually added content. She's been an excellent critical friend. So I hope you purchase the book. It's Breaking the Sound Barrier. You can find it on Amazon. We, I think, recently reduced it by £2 or £3 because some of you said it was quite expensive. And I really hope that you enjoy it and you find it helpful. Thank you, and stay safe in this time of coronavirus outbreak. Stay at home. All the best, and I hope to see you back on this channel soon. Ciao.